Now the first panel has the title EU Defense and European Defense, or EU Defense or European Defense, Franco-German Visions and Ambitions. Now if you would have asked Sweden at least a couple of years ago about EU defense, European defense, visions and ambitions, the reply would have been no, 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 and no. But I think it's fair to say that there's been quite a lot of change the last years, thanks to Trump, Brexit, internal choices in Sweden and internal momentum within the European Union. But we are definitely more interested today in European defense. We actually have a few ambitions. I don't know about the visions yet, but still there's a lot of interest, and much of that interest goes into France and Germany. And I think Sweden, as many other countries, have been waiting to see now after Brexit what this German-French engine will deliver. And I think we have an excellent panel here today to explain that for us. We have Dr. Barbara Kunz, a research fellow at the IFIRI in Paris. We have Dr. Jana, head of the Alfred von Oppenheim Center for European Policy Studies, DGAP, also in Berlin, and Mr. Martin Kenzie, fellow and senior program officer, Security and Defense at the German Marshall Fund in Paris. And as I said, the focus will be on the French and German relation, the engine, but also on their wider visions. What is there for the EU to do in this field? What is European in this field? And I think, an engine or an axis of two countries can be powerful and influential in two ways. Either because the countries are very similar, so you can just aggregate their resources and political influence. That's one way of driving cooperation. The alternative is when two countries are very different. Then, of course, if they manage to strike a grand bargain, you will find other countries actually existing in between. All the preferences are assembled within this. And I think the later case of two countries being rather different than striking a compromise would have been France and the UK, for example, in the San Malo Agreement or Declaration, which really opened up for this entire policy area. Because when they finally could unite around some compromise on European autonomy, other member states of the European Union would find themselves somewhere there in the middle. Now, I'm interested to hear also what you think about this engine. Is it an engine at all? And is it an engine of power of similarity or really power of differences? And I think we'll just revise the order of speakers as printed here. Then we start with Martin, who will give more of a French perspective, then over to Jana, who will give a German perspective, and then Barbara will really zoom in on the engine itself and its workings. And there will also be ample time for the audience to come with interventions and questions afterwards. So, Martin, please.
Thank you very much, Björn, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for the invitation. Well, I'm not a French diplomat, but I was asked to present the French perspective, so I'll try to do that in a couple of minutes. Maybe my point to summarize is to say that France has one big asset in this debate, is that it knows what it wants. At the strategic level, there is a coherent vision for European defense cooperation. The main problem is that when trying to implement this vision, we have often failed at the tactical and at the communication level. And this is something that has now become well known by the French government, to a point where the question whether we become some kind of a leader without followers is one that is very much shared in Paris. And I will build my presentation on these 2 points, on the strategic level and the communication level. On strategy, if you want to think about how France envisions European defense cooperation, there are 3 levels of cooperation. One is NATO, one is the EU, and one is ad hoc frameworks. And there is a very pragmatic articulation of the 3 levels of cooperation, meaning that France is not ideological at all with regards to our institutions. The mission will define the coalition. There is no ideology behind supporting NATO, EU, or ad hoc framework rather than the other. Which is something that explains also some of the decisions with regards to the European Intervention Initiative, our position in PESCO, or the EDF. This also means that for France, European defense initiatives are about defense and not about Europe. Using defense as a mean to strengthen the European project is in a way counterproductive. And that is one of the points that I believe we will discuss in this panel, because it is, I think, a major difference with our European partners. The second point at the strategic level is that we have, I think we have somehow settled the question of threat perception in France, meaning that we do not want to prioritize. If you ask a French official whether we are more to the south or the east, the answer is always both. And I believe, for a point, that it was some kind of a communication trick, not to admit that actually France is all about the south, it's all about Africa. The truth is that actually it makes sense politically, because for France it is impossible to choose whether it would be more critical for our security to have another terrorist attack that has been designed by an enemy in the south, or to have a disinformation attack that would weaken our institutions and our political stability coming from Russia. And this is, I believe, something that both officials, political and administration level, really have in mind. And the third strategic element is that in the long run, France is aiming for European strategic autonomy. And that is a big word, being very criticized for not, in a way, defining this word enough. If I want to try to define it the French way, I would say that there are three aspects to the strategic autonomy debate. One is you need to be autonomous and you need to have a decision-making platform or institution that allows you to make decisions on your own. The second is you have to be autonomous at the operational level. You have to have the capabilities to act and to project power. And the third is you have to be autonomous at the industrial level, meaning that, and that is something very French, having the capabilities is nothing if you can't use them the way you want. Our experience with buying US drones to operate in the Mali and in Sahel is that we have to call DC every single time we want to use these capabilities. This is something that cannot be considered strategically autonomous, and that is a big debate. What it also implies is that there is no EU strategic autonomy. Post-Brexit, on all three levels, decision-making, operational and industrial, you need the UK. There cannot be an EU strategic autonomy in that definition. Now, moving on the more tactical communication issues. Maybe to say something quite obvious, France, like every country, has also its internal divergences. And obviously the MFA, the MOD, the presidency don't necessarily share the same views on every topic. And this is something that was quite clear during the negotiation on PESCO, where you could have different schools of thought within the French administration, those who believe in PESCO as a more European project, and those who wanted to have a more strategic/defense focus for PESCO. This maybe we'll talk with Barbara later. I think it's particularly important to understand the state of the Franco-German cooperation. Is that whether you talk to people at the in the diplomatic corps or in the military in France, they have a very different view of what's going on between Paris and Berlin. The second point is that I feel we French tend to underestimate how much our image may be a problem in our discussions with our European partners with regards to NATO and European cooperation. And one reason for it is that when I attend seminars, meetings all around Europe, I'm always struck to see that the French continue often to be seen as some kind of Gaullist, anti-NATO, anti-US entity, having a hidden agenda to promote French interests within the European project. And this is something that is kind of difficult to hear when you stand in Paris, because one reason is that we understood the 2008 decision to reintegrate the military command as a way to close the debate. And this has not been understood that way by our allies. But if you talk to, again, French official, 2008, and the decision of Nicolas Sarkozy to reintegrate the military command was a way for France to say we are fully committed to the alliance, and we are not in an ambiguous position vis-à-vis the US. However, I feel that this debate is not closed all around Europe. And now, these are more kind of long-term issues, but looking at this current government and the most recent initiatives and developments on European defense cooperation, there are a couple of failures, I would say, in terms of communication on our side. Obviously, recently the term European Army has been used by Emmanuel Macron. We can come back to this. My feeling in France is that nobody really supports the idea of a European army or even can define what it means, but it was understood as some kind of a political tool to talk about defense and to talk about defense cooperation as part of the European elections campaign. This is an issue, right? If you want to talk about these issues with your population, you can't necessarily talk about PESCO, 42-7, EDF. That does not work so well. Using a concept like European Army that is ill-defined has its issues as well, but it can be interesting from a more political communication strategy standpoint. Second issue is the initiative going on redefining or at least giving more content behind the 42.7 article. There again, there's been sometimes this temptation on the French side to come up with kind of grand vision without necessarily explaining what you mean behind. We now have a series of scenarios that are being considered to give more content to the solidarity article in the EU treaty. This has triggered a lot of reactions in Germany and in the B4 countries in particular. I think it had been handled a bit uncautiously in terms of communication, because again, if you look at what the French really propose, there's nothing that controversial. And last but not least, there is an ambiguous position vis-à-vis the UK. As I said, France is clearly aware that whatever they want to do, actually, they need the UK in. There is no EU strategic autonomy, there is a European strategic autonomy role. There is no collective defense within NATO without the UK, and there is no, I would say, even credible nuclear policy in France without the strong partnership that we built with the UK as part of the Lancaster House Treaty. However, our position in the different EU initiatives, PESCO, EDF in particular, and with regards to keeping the UK kind of out of some of these initiatives, may appear a bit contradictory. And this is more, again, I believe, a more tactical issue than a strategic one. And this is where we could find compromises maybe with Germany. And I would just finish by saying that I'm a bit concerned looking ahead that France may be, like Germany, more and more looking inward in the coming years. You all know the situation in France. I think that domestic politics will play more of a kind of a spoiling role in our foreign policy and European policy in the months to come, and that is a risk to keep in mind. We will probably see the first implications of this at the economic level with regards to our ability to respect the Maastricht 3% criteria. But beyond that, defense policy may be affected as well, and President Macron has committed to 2%. However, I'm now considering that this commitment may not be as strong as it used to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Just one quick follow-up question. I mean, you could argue that today we see more of a kind of a traditional geopolitical logic once again coming both in the world but also in our neighborhood after decades of more of a kind of globalization paradigm. Does Does this kind of give France more confidence? I mean, if you look at your role, you are after Brexit, you will be the only EU member with the nuclear weapons, with a seat at the UN security table or a permanent seat. Does this kind of balance the relationship with Germany? When you speak to French diplomats, you kind of get the sense that they are slightly more self-confident in this new world than in the one we just enjoyed.
In a way, that's what I mean by being ambiguous with regards to Brexit and to the European leaving. I think, though, that officially, and even behind closed doors, you won't find a French diplomat saying that we will use our defense assets as a leverage in our discussion with Germany. The way that it can be portrayed, in the press is, okay, now if you want a nuclear umbrella, then you have to give us what we want on the Eurozone issue. I mean, it won't work that way. And these are things that are still in the French mind quite compartmentalized. So it may look like we may benefit from Brexit. However, at technical level, I've never really heard a convincing argument to say so.
Thank you very much. Okay, Jana, please give us the German perspective.
So now you get the German vision and ambition, and I think Barbara's job will be pretty easy after I spoke. When we talk about the Franco-German engine, I would like to talk about the German engine first. So what drives Germany? What makes Germany move on security and defense? And there are actually three motivations ever since 2016 and ever since these new European security initiatives took off. So first, it's very obvious, it's the erosion of European security and changed security environment in Europe, plus the Munich consensus, something that Germany invented in 2014, the claim to take more responsibility on the international stage. So the Germans saw that the security landscape around them was eroding, and they felt particularly obliged to do something about it. So that was the first motivation. The second one was the Trump administration in the United States and the feeling in, I think, most German ministries and the Chancellery that something is significantly shifting and that it's not just about the president, but that the US is moving from being a European power to a power in Europe, and that Europeans need to do more. But then the third motivation from a German perspective, and I think this is the most crucial one, was the Brexit decision of the Brits and the miserable state of the European Union. 2016 was a horrible year for European integration, and European integration and all things European are deeply engraved into the German DNA. So all of a sudden the Germans thought that this club is falling apart, and they wanted to come up with something to hold the club together. And that was the very first motivation, or the most significant motivation for Germans to speed up these European defense initiatives, and the motivation behind the Steinmeier-Hérault paper and the von der Leyen-Le Drian paper, which came immediately after Brexit. So these European security initiatives, the kind of acronyms you hear about, are a product of the idea to be a counterweight to the trend of the erosion of the European Union, something that is supposed to hold the club together, something that is seen as a glue for European integration. And I would argue that to this day, the German efforts to build a European security and defense union, as the Germans always say, is driven by this strong motivation to keep the club together. So it's an integration logic. And Martin said, for the French, it's about defense and less about Europe, and for the Germans, it's the complete opposite. It's exactly about Europe, and it's less so about defense. For Germans, the focus of this endeavor to keep the club together and to use security and defense as a glue is the whole of the EU. It's not some exclusive club, it's not the former or the old member states leaving Central and Eastern Europe behind. It's about all 27. And it's a members-only approach. That is also very interesting when it comes to dealing with the UK. What Germany wants to achieve through the initiatives, through EDF, PESCO, and CARD, is kind of something that is for members only and that binds them together, but that also does not encourage any of the 27 to leave this club. And that's also why the Germans are insisting that, of course, the UK can participate in PESCO and EDF, but only to a certain extent, and that there has to be a significant difference between those being a member of the club and those outside the club. Germany sees itself as bridge builder, and that's why we are pretty pleased with the result of these initiatives, particularly of PESCO. I mean, whereas the French, I mean, Martin did not mention this, but seems to be pretty frustrated and disillusioned with these initiatives. The Germans think all things are going pretty well, but for Germans it's already a success if 25 members of the EU agree on the PESCO project. So that is the level of ambition, that is success already seen from a German perspective. So it could go faster, of course, also from the German position, but overall, from a German position, it's moving into the right direction. So the German vision would be to build a European security and defense union, and that is a rather lofty phrase, and nobody really knows what's behind it, but I think the idea is a Europe that can defend itself on the basis of a common understanding and joint capabilities. So the long-term vision is indeed, and I've double-checked this with the MOD, is a European army, but only very, very many years down the road. And this European army shall be achieved through the army of the Europeans, through PESCO and the Framework Nation concept, and through making it possible for European armies to work closely together and to work on interoperability. So this whole European security and defense union is seen as a bottom-up process, as a slow process which cannot be rushed. It's about building capabilities which are substantial and long-lasting. It's about joint planning and joint development. It's about joint procedures and structures. And the process should include as many EU states as possible. And the aim is not quick kinetic interventions somewhere in Africa. That is totally not the German idea about it, because there is this still deeply rooted skepticism in Germany about the success of military interventions per se. And you hear that very often when you talk to German officials. You hear them mentioning Libya and Iraq and say that these weren't exactly success stories, and why should we now become more French and do more interventions all over Africa? Because this is kind of not a very successful, not seen as a very successful role model, and so there is no need to follow this. So the aim is to build capabilities which can then, and this is important, also be used within NATO. That is one of the mantras currently used in Germany: stay transatlantic and become more European. So this security and defense union is not seen as something that should do collective defense beside that stupid term defense union, but that's not for collective defense. Collective defense is done in NATO. And you have to understand that despite the sometimes very strong language from Germany, like the European Army or the European Union being a counterweight to the US, Germany is very status quo oriented. So Germany actually doesn't like change, and that is, I think, very typical for Germans in every sense. So NATO is seen still as our first line of defense, and the current re-emphasis on territorial defense strengthens this even more. So Germany is very proud of its very substantial contributions in NATO, and that it has beefed up its efforts to an unknown or unprecedented extent. EU and NATO are seen as complementary, and strategic autonomy is not understood as something that should be achieved within the EU or outside NATO. I think Germans are not even sure if it should be achieved at all. They have kind of a very awkward relationship to the term strategic autonomy. It's not very often used in our kind of strategic documents. But if we talk about strategic autonomy, we talk about it like this. not as something that is opposed to the United States or that should be achieved outside NATO. So European defense is seen as something that is defined through the EU and NATO framework, whereas EU defense is a rather inclusive, acronym-driven thing that should serve European or EU unity. European defense is through EU and NATO, and that's why the Germans had so many problems with this ad hoc and flexible coalitions the French seem to love so much. That's why actually we joined the European Intervention Initiative, and I think that's a very British motivation. I mean, the Brits were kind of always, we thought about the Brits that they joined kind of EU security and defense initiatives only to spoil them. I think there is kind of this understanding in Germany that we joined the European Intervention Initiative to prevent the worst from happening and to make sure that it's as closely linked to the EU structures as possible. And so we have an aversion against flexible coalitions outside the EU and NATO framework. There is a deep mistrust in Germany that this European Intervention Initiative serves as a tool for German soldiers to be dragged into adventurous missions in Africa or in the Middle East. And it's seen actually, Germany sees itself in an international environment where multilateral institutions, all sorts of multilateral institutions are attacked, and it doesn't see ad hoc coalitions as something that heals this or that can counter these attacks. So it should be about strengthening the supranational institutions, strengthening the EU, and not building kind of or having side projects weakening the EU. So to sum this up, Germany is not sharing France's deep frustration, even though Martin hasn't talked about the deep frustration, maybe Barbara will, about the slow process and the little outcome. It is convinced that, Germany is convinced that it really has delivered substantially. The German idea was never to become more French. I think there was kind of different expectations in Paris. Germany does not share the French sense of urgency, or the idea that we have to aim for strategic autonomy kind of immediately. It does not see a sense in quick kinetic operations and does not see them as the ultimate goal. There's a deep skepticism. There's a different understanding of the role of the military, also when it comes to countering terrorism in Africa. Germany doesn't share the French geopolitical vision for the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa, but I leave that for Barbara. There's a deep there is a different understanding, let's put it like this way, why and how we should export arms, which we have then jointly produced, about all things nuclear, and we have a very different decision-making process. But to some extent, I think Germany and France are the extremes, and if we could somehow merge these positions, I think a lot of ground would be covered. And then it goes with this.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question for clarification. Now since you took up this elephant in the room, the European army, I mean, if the Germans do not appreciate these kind of kinetic operations in the neighborhood and wants to have territorial defense also in the future, clearly based within NATO, if we ever would see something similar to European army, what would it do?
I think that is, as I said, it's a bottom-up process, and the end is a long-term vision. But if you have followed the speeches recent speeches of Ursula von der Leyen, she doesn't see the European army as a contradiction to NATO. So the European army, I guess, would then be also a helpful tool or would be used within the NATO framework, so there is no contradiction. But I think the Germans really leave it also very abstract. It's just, I always hear the comparison between, that is like the Eurozone, which would have been unthinkable in the 50s. This is just a long-term goal. But it was actually reaffirmed by our defense minister several times, not only by the chancellor recently, that we really want to have this European army in the far distant future and see it as a vision.
Thank you very much. Now, Barbara, it's time for you to talk about this engine. How do you unite these perspectives?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thanks to Martin and Jana, because thanks to their speeches, I do not need to rewrite my entry point into my remarks, which will start by saying that obviously France and Germany are not on the same page, which you could hear. And I think what is really important to note in this context that we are not in a situation where we have a competition of visions. That's not the starting point in this relationship, and this is also why common ground in a way is very hard to find, because the Franco-German defense relationship is rather a set of asymmetries rather than competing visions. And I mean, these asymmetries or incompatibilities, I won't go into details, but they're obviously located at the level of strategic culture, public opinions, also political systems that are extremely different, which makes it hard to find counterparts simply, and of course also very different decision-making processes. So that is one set of asymmetry, but I think the most important asymmetry right now is unveiled if you look at what is not part of the respective national debates. And this is what I want to use the next 5 minutes to. If you look at the German debate and ask what is not part of the German debate, well then you can see that interventions are basically absent, which doesn't mean that Germany does not do interventions. I mean, maybe not as tough ones as the French would like to see, but Germany is in Mali and so on, but that's not very high on the agenda, so to say. But also not part of the German debate is fighting terrorists. I mean, it's somewhere in the white paper, but in reality, as Jana already said, it's not a real priority. But then finally, the third point, and that's the key point here, is what's not part of the German debate is urgency and ambition. And that, as Jana also already said, leads to a lot of frustration in France, especially since this Munich consensus created expectations of Germany actually not becoming French, but Germany becoming normal, which is the same as being French. So a lot of frustration here in Paris. Now, if you look at the French debate, and I think honestly that this is much more relevant for, if I may say so, you here in Northern Europe, what's not part of the French debate is, to a very large extent, Russia, and the whole Eastern threat dimension. I would also warn against interpreting France's relatively increased presence in the Baltic Sea region in recent years as a changed threat perception. To me, the explaining factors here is rather realizations that the relative French absence was not good for France's standing in NATO, and also a certain need, given this frustration with Germany, a certain need also to find new best friends, and some of them have been found in this region. Very second important absent dimension in the French debate is collective defense. And in particular, I would say what is really almost totally absent from the French debate is conventional deterrence, which is the one thing that everybody here is talking about, right? And because it is also important to understand that if you say deterrence in France, it is automatically linked to nuclear deterrence, but the conventional dimension of deterrence is not really part of the French debate. And that, of course, means, or that explains why the French debate, if you look at it from above and in a total, I mean, in a European context, that is why the French debate is so far off from the rest of the European debate, maybe with some exceptions in, I don't know, Italy, Greece, but Italy, Spain or so. But this is why the French debate has such problems to connect also with the rest of the European debate. And as you can see from that, even in terms of priorities or things that are close to Paris's and Berlin's heart, France and Germany are not on the same page, and this also explains why both actually have better friends than each other when it comes to defense cooperation, meaning that what's happening in Franco-German defense cooperation very often is rather derived from a political need to uphold this image of a functioning Franco-German engine or functioning Franco-German relationship rather than from real defense considerations. Now, what does that mean for this engine? I would argue, I mean, all the talk about European armies and so on notwithstanding, is there is absolutely no joint vision for European defense, Franco-German joint vision for European defense in, let's say, 2030. That applies to CSDP, but that also applies to European defense in the larger understanding. I mean, just to open the parenthesis, whether there really are national visions for that is also quite questionable, closing the parenthesis. But in any case, there is no such strategic visions. I don't really see any development towards such a vision. And I mean, one indicator for that could be that the core project of Franco-German Defense Cooperation right now is this plane, the FCAS, which is a good thing, but I mean, that plane is not a strategy. And it's probably also running into problems because of the export issues Jana already mentioned. I mean, in terms of really strategic visions, there's not so much there, and I don't see that change, as I said. The problem is now that European security really is at the crossroads because of the deteriorating environment, but also because of the transatlantic link and the state it is in. And I mean, as Jana said, and as well, this is going to be a reality well beyond Trump, just because of structural changes in the international system. And what we now have here, it's been alluded to, is a France that wants to lead but doesn't really have followers, and there's a Germany that does have potential followers but doesn't want to lead, which is sort of an unfortunate situation, especially after Brexit. Now, the reasons for that, I think Jana explained quite nicely, and also I think it's due because the German debate is so much more in line with the rest of the European debate, at least in terms of what is talked about, except the European army. On the French side, there is, as Martin also already said, this real inability, I think, on the French side to frame French ideas in a way that allow to plug them into the ongoing strategic debates in Europe for all the reasons Martin says. And then I would add this idea that defense and deterrence just refer to something completely different in a French context than in sort of the rest of Europe. And the key example for that, and I almost end on that, is of course the notion of strategic autonomy, which I think in line of what's going on transatlantically, it really makes sense to think about strategic autonomy. The real problem is the definition of the referent object of that notion. Like, in what do we want to become? Do we want to become autonomous or strategically autonomous? And I think really the French have a point, but the marketing, if I may put it like that, the marketing is so bad that it becomes very easy to discard it. Like, no, we do not want to replace NATO, but if you keep in mind what I just said about the French debate, NATO is not on the agenda here. So there are a lot of things that would really be worth debating, but are not debated, because I think there's clearly sort of lack of translation, basically, between the French debate and the rest of Europe debate, to put it that way. And so that would be my first recommendation, is to really invest more in this sort of translation to find the possibilities to join these debates. And of course, the second idea, and this hopefully answers to your question on how to do, is I think it's not about bridging differences and finding compromise between different visions, but really to bet on complementarity. Just starting from the idea that what NATO calls a 360 degrees approach is absolutely indispensable. It's not about whether we want to invest in the south or in the east, and we sort of end up in a compromise between the two. There is no such compromise. It's really about both. And this is the way where we need to move forward, and in this context it is worth listening to some French ideas. It is definitely necessary to push the Germans to become more active, but it is also very important to sort of raise the awareness in France for what's debated elsewhere.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Just a question, if the French-German engine is not really delivering in this field, I mean, if we look at other policy areas right now in the European Union, when this engine is not delivering or is delivering something, content that is not appreciated, you see quite a few new groupings. You see the Hanseatic League in the north, or the Nordics, or different various groupings in the east of Europe, kind of being more proactive and pushing for their own policies. Do you see such a development coming in the defense area as well, that this leaves room for other groupings or other engines?
Yes and no. I mean, my first remark would be that I think we have to move beyond this traditional understanding of the Franco-German engine, because that traditional understanding emerged in a Europe that was binary, where you had like a northern fraction, a southern fraction, France and Germany representing each one of these fractions, and if they find compromise, there's a compromise. Today's Europe is no longer binary, but with shifting alliances and often more than two blocks, a bit like the Swedish parliament. And so finding compromise there in terms of an engine is much more complicated. So that's a general remark. I think in terms of defense, there is not really any other alternative than doing it all together, just because the threats are so big, and we're all too small to tackle that together. Even France and Germany together are too small to tackle it together, so it has to be a European response.
On that point, on doing it together, I have a question to all of you, and it's something you already started to discuss, namely on the PESCO and the E2I. And Jana, you explained that Germany is really after integration. They have a political ambition in this field, and they were pretty happy with the way PESCO turned out, being very inclusive, not a VIP club. But the cost of that, of course, and you already kind of indicated that the French were perhaps less happy with this, frustration with this, is that they choose to establish cooperation outside of the EU, to some extent to cater for this, perhaps in the future to external operations. Is there any sense in Germany that this was a pretty kind of a Pyrrhus victory, a costly approach? You got your will and you got a very inclusive PESCO, but you also see unity, one of your main goals, kind of disappearing because part of the mission is transferred outside of the EU. Was this a trade-off?
I think that was also one of the reasons why Germany joined, because Germany, I think, felt obliged also to show some commitment to the French, but at the same time there is this ideological preference which the Germans have for EU cooperation, which the French don't have, and so I think the ultimate German goal now is to work on the European Intervention Initiative and to move it as closely as possible to the PESCO and EU framework. I don't know if the Germans will go very far with this, because I think that's totally not the French understanding. This is the idea to communicate that it has to be, that we have to strengthen the EU. But it was also, I think, a sign of goodwill to join this, and I think that, I mean, it was really hotly debated, and there were a lot of bright think tankers advocating for it, and a lot of German officials who really didn't want to.
Yeah, I would have a bit of different perspective actually on France and PESCO. I mean, there's been frustration, definitely. There was this idea that it could be more of an inclusive project. However, if you see what France is doing now, it is very committed in terms of the different projects on both batches of the project. And also, I would say that they haven't completely given up on the idea that it could turn out being more exclusive with time. The idea that it's not about the project, it's about the commitments. And in terms of commitments, what I heard at the French MOD is that many countries will wake up one day and figure out that PESCO is much more ambitious than they thought, and they will maybe decide to leave on their own. And the PESCO 25 that you see today may not be the PESCO that we have in 3 years from now because of these commitments. And we can end up with 15 countries that are actually the avant-garde that was thought by France when the whole negotiation started. So there's frustration, but not despair.
So PESCO as a French Trojan horse within the EU.
And second is the E2I is not an answer to PESCO. There's a big problem in terms of timeline because it was kind of announced with the Sovereign speech. It came up as it sounded like, okay, the French are disappointed with PESCO, so they're creating this ad hoc outside the EU initiative. But it's not at all like this. It's a project that's been built and thought of since the Mali intervention in 2013. That's been more concretized in mind after the Bataclan attack in 2015. And in any way, I believe that what the E2I is doing was never meant to be part of PESCO. It was not, PESCO was not something that could become a forum for discussing, contingency planning, that sort, and intelligence sharing. The E2I is not a capability or procurement project. They are actually very complementary in that sense. And so it sounds a bit, I would say it's kind of easy to feel like, okay, it's a response to PESCO, but it was maybe really not designed that.
I just say, we not only have a great expertise here at the table, but also in the audience, so please indicate if you have a question. I already see several. You have a microphone?
Yes.
Way. Yeah. So I think we open up for some questions, and please present yourself.
Thank you, Ed. Sorry. An excellent panel, by the way. Thank you very much. Julian and French. I couldn't resist this. Look, I've been in this 30 years. I wrote the original SDP document. And sometimes it feels like we're stuck in this film, The Groundhog Day, the old Bill Murray film. I mean, the gap between our assessment of the threats that all we Europeans face, and you're absolutely right, we're all too small to deal with them, the realization that the Americans are increasingly overstretched and will need Europeans collectively as effective first responders. And yet our ongoing obsession with institutional tinkering to achieve a defence outcome that is simply implausible. Look at the new DGAP-IISS report on how weak is the European defence effort. My question is simply this: what will it take for we Europeans to properly assess the environment into which we're moving together and then make serious choices about how we achieve the defence outcomes to maintain peace with the forces and resources so required?
Do you want to reply directly, or should we go to several questions? Oh, that, please go. Jana.
I couldn't, like the personal me couldn't agree more. The German me would maybe answer differently, but I think that what strikes me in Germany most of the time is that kind of when you talk to decision makers, especially in the MOD but also in the NSA, there is no problem with the analysis of the situation. I really get the impression, I mean, it's all known. It's known that the Europeans must do more, it's known that the Germans must step up, all that is known. And still, nothing significant happens. As I said, we are very status quo oriented, and we are still focusing very much on EU and data structures, and have problems of thinking as European defense as a toolbox with different tools, and maybe also new ones and innovative ones. And I totally agree with Martin that the European, the EI2 and PESCO could complement each other. It's just that I don't know how to fill this gap. And I talked with Martin a couple of days ago that it feels like either we are kind of traumatized or paralyzed, I don't know what it needs. The thing is that the only thing I could envision that would really wake us up would be such a catastrophic event, like sleepwalking into the First World War, somehow also in the Second World War, that I don't want to see that happening. So there is this gap between, also in Germany, between the analysis and the deeds on the ground. And so it feels like sleepwalking into something slowly, slowly.
Just to add on that, I mean, first, I really see Germany as the key country within Europe on that. And the one actor that can get Germany to move is the Americans. I think it's also and Putin in a way, but in a constructive way, I don't see any other actor than the Americans there. And I think it would be really helpful, actually, if the Americans could be extremely blunt to the Germans, and also outside of Trump, because Trump is so easy to discard as well. It's just Trump, and that will go over, and let's just wait for this to be over. So if the Americans really made clear, and if the Americans, for instance, endorsed European strategic autonomy as a requirement for future American engagement in Europe, I think that could really get things going. Not just in Germany, by the way, but also in the number of countries, well, for example, around the Baltic Sea.
I just quickly wanted to add something, because from a German perspective, if you talk to German officials, and especially in 2016, you really get the feelings that the Germans think that they have done already so much more. This is also kind of part of the problem, that the Germans, and that's true compared to where Germany started, that from 2014 onwards the Germans have done significantly more. It's just, if you compare it to what would be needed, it's very little. But in Germany there is this sense, oh, we have delivered, we've beefed up our contributions, we've done so much more.
Yes. Claudia Mayor from the German Institute of National Security Studies. I've got a question to you, Martin. You said that France is very much behaves a bit like a leader without followers, and I tend to think that's very much the same for the Franco-German so-called engine, because it doesn't work in the inside, no agreement on priorities, on frameworks, on capabilities, on industries, and it also applies to the outside, because there's nobody to lead. No countries actually really buy into that engine thingy. So I think what we desperately need is a reality check that this engine is not what other countries are looking for, nor are they willing to buy in. So maybe the whole rhetoric of the German couple leading Europe is only spending 1.3%, but France is spending 2%. So some 40 billion. If Germany would live up to the 2%, which I personally would love, but I don't think it will realize, Germany would spend something like 80, or if the economy goes well, 90 billion euros. What would the French reaction to that spending gap be, given that there would be a country with lots of money, not doing much, and a country with far less money, pretending to do a lot?
I appreciate the question. One is whether we are able to shift our software and think that the Franco-German engine is not working, or at least try to find other alternatives to it. I think here, Emmanuel Macron has been relatively ideological actually about it. He's a kind of pragmatic leader, but on this issue, he's came to power clearly saying that his priority for the next 5 years, now 3 years to come, will be the Franco-German relationship. And in January 2018, when he gave his New Year address to the French diplomatic corps, he said again, every French president comes to power and wants to do Franco-German, and after a year or two, he sees that it doesn't work out, so he does Franco-Italian, Franco-Polish. I will not do that. That's what he said. I will not do that. That is not my strategy. I will keep on going with the Franco-German. So there is quite ideological, and he believes that is the right way. Now, as Jana and Barbara mentioned, there's growing frustration in France with Germany. We're talking about defense, but on basically almost all matters. The idea that we didn't get from this relationship what we expected is shared all across the political spectrum in France. Now, on your second question on the budget, officially you know that the French position is always that that they don't care that much about budget or capability, they care about what you do with it. So if the Poles have now 150,000 armed troops but don't do anything with it outside their territory, you know, that gives us very different pictures than, say, the Estonians sending 50 people to Mali. That's all about the use of what you have. And if Germany has a budget that would be 50% bigger than the French one, but continues with the same kind of statu quo strategy, I believe that for the French, the problem will be exactly the same as today. The real problem is whether we can do things together and project power outside of Europe.
Thank you. Work as well. Yeah. You hear it. Here, I think that's better. Yeah. Thank you so much for a very interesting intervention. And I really like this distinction about Germany that yes, we have done a lot of things, but still there is no sense of urgency. And this is for me a key concept in this discussion, the sense of urgency. Now France has vision. And other countries, as we heard this morning, the Latvian State Secretary, the frontline states, the Baltic state, Poland, also I would say Finland, they have a sense of urgency, perhaps. So that's the question, could this be more of a force used by France than it has been so far in pushing the agenda, and could that also help push Germany? And my second question related to that is, as we have heard then, for smaller nations, how can countries that are, like the Nordic countries and others, be more helpful in aligning to this discussion between that? We have a feeling it goes a lot of ping pong between Berlin and Paris, but you know, what would be your advice for us to hook into that kind of debate and for it to be useful to develop? Because Europe is not only about this engine, there are a few others around as well. Thank you.
Right down.
You want to start?
On the second part on what Nordic countries do and influence this debate, I think that the issue here is that there's still a kind of a cartoonish vision of what Nordic countries want in Paris. And that as much as I agree with Barbara that say Russia or conventional deterrence is not really part of the French debate, there is also this idea that this is the only thing that they talk about east of Germany, you know, and that also, or north of Germany, and that also in a way blocks this kind of dialogue, because there is an expectation that we cannot talk about anything but Russia if you go to Nordic countries or default countries. I would assume that having I would say a more honest conversation about the future of the transatlantic relationship would be a good start. I in a way disagree with Jana in saying that France and Germany represent two extremes. I would say that France and Poland tend to represent two extremes, and perhaps even France and Sweden to a certain extent. And Germany is or should be some kind of the kingmaker here. The situation vis-à-vis the US is, in my opinion, the real issue that we should talk about as Europeans. And one more concrete implication of it, and there I have absolutely no answer, I see no compromise on this issue, is the industrial aspect of it. And whether we consider that, as I mentioned, a European strategic autonomy should include an industrial aspect, and therefore should include a more assertive promotion of European industrial base. This is a debate that is extremely difficult to have, especially with Sweden, considering the difference in the structure of your industrial base compared to us, and the ability of Swedish companies to apply for European money obviously goes against the French vision of what should be done with European taxpayers' money. So I would say first, let's talk about the transatlantic relationship. We are the Atlantic Council, so it's kind of topical. But second, and there I have no solution, is what do we do with the industry? And there is, I think, the bigger thing. Yeah.
just on the transatlantic relationship, because I mean we were afraid that we agree too much, and here I totally disagree with Martin, because I mean you're right. I was, when I talked about the extremes, I was talking about kind of the relationship to the military. I think Germany and French see the military or use military means totally differently. But transatlantic relations, you're right. It's Poland or the Baltic states and France. But then when you say we must be more honest, I think this is a totally French answer, because what is honest? Because I mean, and then maybe I'm very German and bridge building, but I can totally see that from a Polish or perspective of the Baltic states, there is a sense of urgency, but which could be absolutely matched also in NATO and with the United States, and that kind of we can honestly talk about transatlantic relations, but I mean there is no urgency to throw the child out with the bathwater. So I can totally see that whoever is the next president, that the Europeans have to do more. But I think I can totally understand that in this region, the idea is one can do much more also together with the United States, and not kind of that being honest about transatlantic relations does not necessarily imply to become more independent from the United States. But, so I would just, maybe that's the German bridge building approach, but I mean, being honest about transatlantic relations, it's not being French about transatlantic relations.
Just to add on that, I mean, the debate on transatlantic relations, it must be avoided that this becomes a caricature. We're not talking about whether we want the US implied in Europe or not. It's about what degree we can get from the United States and what we need to do to preserve a degree that helps us. This is what the debate should be. But we're stuck in these theological debates on pro and anti-US, which is just completely ridiculous. And then to respond to your question of what for instance, the Nordics can do, and whether this urgency can be a push. The urgency, there's a problem and a chance in that. The problem with this urgency is that the urgency in different parts of Europe is about completely different things. And in that sense, you might say there is no way of coming together, because we're just, well, Poland tells the French that you only care about Africa and vice versa, and this doesn't get nowhere. But I think there's also a chance in this urgency being about different things, because that's what ensures a 360 degrees approach. And it also paves the way for more transactional approaches, which is on the complete other end of the spectrum. And I always talk about the European army and all of that. But if you take the French-Estonian relationship as an example, I mean, how much the Estonians get out of that, I leave that debate to the Estonians, but still where basically it's okay, we help you in the east and you help us in the south. I think that can be quite a good basis for solidarity for ensuring European security, if it's happening on a bigger scale, so to say. So I think that would be one step. Just talk about these urgencies and not try to pitch them against each other, but just see the complementarity, as I said earlier, in it. The second thing would be to also come up with concepts. I mean, European strategic autonomy, to stick with that buzzword. Why wait for a definition from Paris or Brussels or Paris and Berlin? Why not just start proposing ideas, I mean, very concrete declinations of what European strategic autonomy could mean? That, I think, coming with more concepts and not just wait for concepts coming from elsewhere, having a much more proactive stance, that could also be really helpful. And then the third, I mean, this is on a lower level, it's just nag Germans, really. Make sure that Germany is behaving like a small state with the US, and just getting Germany out of this small state behavior and say, okay, you're the biggest country in Europe and you're the richest country in Europe, take on your responsibility. I think the more there is in that direction, the greater the small chance, certainly, to wake the Germans up.
And I Heiko Maas just gave you a perfect tool because he wants to build up on the concept of Europe United as the answer to America first. And you could absolutely tell the Germans, if you want Europe United, you have to contribute your fair share. And if you want us to kind of rely on you, then please be more reliable. And so I think you could use that in communicating with Germany to use exactly this concept. But the problem from a German perspective, and coming back to your sense of urgency, is that from a German perspective there are no quick fixes to some of the problems. And that is also, I think there is also some truth to that. So for Germans, quick military kinetic operations, not sustainable, that is not the answer. So the idea really is no quick fix available. We have to have this bottom-up process, and we have to have European capabilities. I know that it takes long, but the Germans see that not only as a cheap excuse for not doing anything, but also as the right answer, because this takes time, this needs to have the public behind, and all this.
I have to resist answering to what Jana said on the Transatlantic dialogue. I obviously was not meant to say that they should become more French. But what I mean by honest is that I think there is also a tendency in many European countries to want France to remain France in a way. And so, when I was talking about the 2008 reintegration in the military command, I think this is important to understand that there is no doubt in France that the basis for collective security is NATO, that we need US support for European security, that we need US defense guarantees. I mean, this is repeated again and again in our strategic review in 2017, in our two last white books. There is no doubt anywhere that we need the US. So that's what I mean by being honest. Let's not try to corner France as this kind of anti-NATO, anti-US partner when we talk about the transatlantic relationship. Now, when we talk about what to do with this current environment, you were saying yourself, the risk is to be sleepwalking. And I think that is the French position on how we Europeans turn to engage with the changes in the US. Now, usually, to oppose this idea of sleepwalking, you hear the idea of, well, self-fulfilling prophecy. You French are accelerating a process by pushing the US away. That is the kind of conversation that I think should be more honest. And are we sleepwalking? Are we creating actually the prophecy? These kind of things do not happen, and often because as a French, I tend to feel like we are being caricaturized as an anti-NATO ally, which is not the case.
So we don't.
We don't.
We don't disagree. We agree.
Please disagree. I just wanted to return to the issue of the strategic autonomy, because something all of you raised, and Barbara, I think, had a really good idea that the need to kind of break up this concept and then fill it with content, since we can't really agree on what it means in theory. But I mean, you also discussed that the degrees of US engagement is really degrees, so it's not binary. While we often discuss European strategic autonomy as binary, either we have it or we don't have it. But of course that's not true. I mean, we already have some sort of agreement on a minimal level of European strategic autonomy since the San Malo Declaration and then the start of the CSDP. It's already in there. And on the other hand, we have ideas about a kind of full independence to rid ourselves of all kind of interdependencies. That would be some kind of EU version of Brexit, not strategic at all. I think most people would argue. So, I mean, you will find European countries somewhere in the middle, but probably on different positions. It's a kind of bounded autonomy in some policy spheres. Could you elaborate a little bit on how the countries, Germany and France especially, finds themselves on this scale of autonomy?
Well, I think the biggest problem probably with this notion is just the name it has. In Europe, I think that most people have an issue with the autonomy of it. In the US, I sometimes get the feeling that strategic is the bigger problem. But if you move away from this interpretation of words and just understand strategic autonomy as a definition of a level of ambition, for what, in this case, since it's in the global strategy, we're talking CSDP here, If you understand it just as a definition of a level of ambition for CSDP, that makes a lot more sense. And I understand where I mean the wording comes from, because as you probably all know, I mean it is a long-standing French notion. It's been in French white paper since 1994, and in a French context, you have like full-fledged definitions of what it means. And Martin alluded to that, and you can also read it in official documents. And why France stands on that, I would actually say it's not really clear, because the one thing that is absolutely not clarified in the French context is how national strategic autonomy, which is the declared objective of French defense policy, how national French strategic autonomy fits with European strategic autonomy, because in reality it doesn't. I mean, or at least if you think both concepts to the end, it can't. I mean, there's especially points of conflict that pertain to the nuclear deterrent on the one hand, and then the whole industrial dimension on the other. So there's a lot of incompatibilities there, and there's also, I would say, no real clear-cut French definition of European strategic autonomy. In Germany, it's about a similar situation, I would say, but on a much lower philosophical level, in a way, where there's just no real debate about what all of this means. I mean, I guess it's starting slowly, but yeah.
Just very quickly, I agree with Barbara on the incompatibility of our definition at national level and what we may want to do at the European level. Maybe just to start, it's interesting to say what it's not. And clearly in the French debate, the autonomy is different from independence. And the idea that it's a way to hide the fact that we're trying to be independent from the US is not true. Actually, strategic autonomy in the way it is defined in French document is often to choose your own interdependence, meaning that you can be interdependent or completely dependent on the US, but it has to be a sovereign choice to do so. And this is the case when we launch an operation in Mali, and basically after 72 hours we need the US support. This is an issue in terms of our strategic documents when we in a way suffer from a lack of autonomy, but it's not a quest for independence.
Thank you. We have several questions now in the audience.
Hi, my name is
at least two in a row.
Catherine Schultz from Melbourne, Princeton University. I wanted to make an observation, which is that I think in these discussions, the U.S. often produces scapegoat of sorts. Right, so we complain about the U.S. pulling back, but then when we say that European strategic autonomy is not developed, it's because the U.S. is not being strong enough on Europe to develop its own capabilities. So Barbara, on your statement that seeing Germany as a key actor, we need to get the U.S. to lean more on Germany, I'm not sure you get much more than the way the U.S. is leading right now. So what would you want the U.S. to say? I mean, I think you've seen the strongest language, the strongest real rhetoric and actions taken on that rhetoric we've seen in years. I'm not sure how much stronger you can get without even further destabilization, which would cause more complaining about the U.S. role. I'm curious what you really think the U.S. should be doing here, because it seems like it's a really convenient scapegoat, and yet it ultimately might be on the Europeans to do so.
Thank you. I actually want to follow on to that excellent question. Imagine we're sitting in somewhere like Akron, Ohio. We've all been sitting here comfortably saying, well, for the foreseeable future we are dependent on the Americans to defend us, which we are. But how would you explain to an American audience why Americans go on defending a bunch of relatively rich Europeans given the pressures on the United States? Isn't that the shock that's coming?
Can you pass the microphone on to Teija? And meanwhile, you can address some of the questions.
Thank you. I'm Teija Tiilikainen, the director of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. There is one recent turn in European defense dimension that we didn't discuss that much, and that's the new focus on capabilities. The new funding instruments, also PESCO and GUARD being related to this idea that the member states, in fact, only have a single set of forces, which then can be used both in the EU and NATO context, which I think nicely brings together this incompatibility of EU and NATO. And there is a new actor in this framework, which is the European Commission, that has tried to take the lead, that has the funding instruments, and knowing the somewhat different perspectives to supranational powers in European integration of France and Germany, I would like to hear your views about how France and Germany view the role of the European Commission. And as there is a debate going on about still strengthening its role in the new coming institutional cycle, how would that look like from the point of view of the Franco-German angle? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have how do we communicate to the Americans, and what about capabilities of the role of institutions? Jana?
I actually would like to start with a counter-observation or counter-question to your question, how to communicate with the Americans. The problem I have is that the Americans tend to be kind of schizophrenic when it comes to European defense as well. That's what's puzzling me personally. I mean, for years and years, the Europeans have heard we should do more and become more independent or kind of autonomous, and that the US is not the quick fix in Libya and Mali and all this. The moment the Europeans do this and are quite confident about their initiatives, and they get this kind of critique from Washington saying, we hate when you talk about the European army, we hate when you talk about strategic autonomy. So I think the communication problem here goes both ways, because I think a lot of Europeans are not really sure what is expected from them other than buying F-35 fighter jets and spending 2% on American weapons. That might have been a bit provocative. When we come back to the single set of forces and EU and NATO, that's a very German approach. That is actually the German narrative. We have one single set of forces, and everything we achieve through projects which we finance through the EDF and do in the PESCO framework should be ready for EU and NATO purposes. And Germany very much encourages. Germany loves institutions, very much encourages the European Commission. Is very happy that the European Commission finally has engaged in this area for the first time, and that is kind of broke a taboo and works on these matters, and that put money on the table. So all this so far is seen as something very positive from the German side, but you have to understand that from a German perspective, the European institutions work very much along the German narrative, so that is very pleasant for us.
Very quickly, I actually agree with Jana, and I think that the French have the same position on EDF and on the Commission being more active on defense issues. There is no debate that we should take back this prerogative and prevent the Commission from. So this is, in a way, some kind of a Franco-German family, Franco-German agreement here. Now, on the US, on this question of how to communicate with the US, and your question, Julian, I think this is fundamentally what is kind of the problem in Paris right now, is that people around Macron thought that they could come to DC and say, we heard you, we understand you want us to do more, and we have a certain vision that we think could answer your need for Europeans to take more of the burden. And the truth is that the French have faced a wall in DC. The first answer was obviously at the Munich Security Conference last year when we heard about European protectionism. That was a sign that clearly we had a very different vision of what Europe should do in the end to take more of the burden. And since, I would say, the spring 2018, at the State Department, there's been also a shift in the narrative. Ms. Mitchell has clearly changed, I think, his position on a certain number of European defense initiatives. And today, as far as I know, in France, this is just surprising. We don't have really an answer of why this is happening. Maybe it's all about the industry. Maybe Jana is right there.
That was just a wild guess.
Yeah. But it is the position that I see now in Paris.
maybe to add on that, the US is a scapegoat. I'm actually not sure at all. I mean, what I really believe in is that the one message that needs to be anchored in Europe is that the current degree of US engagement in European security is an anomaly. It's an exception. And it's sort of a miracle that it lasted 30 years after the Cold War, but it is, as I said, it is an anomaly. And now we will, because of the rise of China and many things that have nothing to do with the Europeans, now we are moving back to a normal situation. And that is what the Europeans need to understand. And that is also where the Europeans must not let themselves be fooled by the European deterrence initiatives and so on. I'm not saying that these are bad initiatives, but I mean, they're just not proof of anything that's happening at a systemic level. That's the message that the Europeans need to understand. And that is a message that the United States, to my mind, could convey much more clearly to the Europeans, and especially in the Atlanticist part of Europe, where there's always the same debate going on, like, the US are retreating, says Macron, and then they say, no, but there's an increase in the European Deterrence Initiative. Look, nothing happens. And then that's where the debate ends. And I think there is a greater role for the US to be more, much clearer about that, and also be much more demanding vis-à-vis the Europeans, and, as I said earlier, endorse this notion of strategic autonomy by just looking beyond the etymology of those two words, but understand it as a level of ambition for CSDP, which is the one thing that really makes sense. And if I may, just one remark on the Commission and strategic things and the definition, again, of strategic autonomy. What will probably happen if we do not manage to find a more strategic concept of what strategic autonomy means is that the Commission will define it. Because, no, but I mean, for European defence planning and for deciding what will be funded by the EDF and so on, you need to have a benchmark. You need grounds on which you decide what should be funded and what should not be. And these grounds, in a way, is an implicit definition of a level of ambition. And I would just like to see a much more strategic take on these issues than a bureaucratic one.
Thank you very much. This German-French engine is quickly approaching lunch, but we have a few minutes left, and I have at least 3 questions that I see, so I'll ask for pretty concise questions, and then we'll give the panel a final say. So we have Andrew Mittag.
Hi, Andrew Mittag, GMF, the Marshall Center. Before I say anything, since I work for the U.S. government, these are my private views, and they do not reflect the policy or position of my government or Defense Department. I'm on a panel after lunch, so I will say some of my comments. I've just rewritten my entire presentation listening to the panel. And I have to tell you that I'm pretty appalled by some of the statements that were made here. Not because, and full disclosure, I'm a committed transatlanticist. I've spent my entire career supporting Euro-Atlantic integration. This is my 3rd tour in Europe. Barbara, when you speak of the U.S. involvement in European security as an anomaly, and may God strike me with this anomaly, and may I never recover. Europe has had the longest period of peace, pure and simple. I currently work in a country that has not only preserved its democratic institutions, has been rebuilt after the war, in large part because of our engagement in Europe, and is now a unified and prosperous democracy. Talking about strategic autonomy without asking a fundamental question of what that strategy is supposed to achieve is a tactical level conversation, number 1. Number 2, it sends a very dangerous message to Washington, that there's an attempt to emancipate yourself in some larger framework, while at the same time, to quote our French colleague, keeping the Americans engaged in the overall defense of the world. That's like, with all due respect, trying to be half pregnant. You want us to continue to deter in the extended deterrence fashion. And by the way, Barbara, we're not pulling out of Europe. If you look at our military deployment, Germany remains a principal entry point for U.S. forces into Europe. We're increasing our presence. Our budget is now at $733 billion, and if you follow the news, we're likely to go to $750 billion next year. We're in a new geostrategic environment that requires all of us to pull together. So this conversation to me is extremely disturbing, because what it stipulates is that somehow that transatlantic link, and we're the Atlantic Council, which has served my country and your country so well, is now up for revision. And the arguments that I hear, well, it's President Trump, it's President Macron, it's this and the other. We should not be looking for excuses in this conversation. We should be looking for what brings us together, because I'm staring in Asia Pacific at a rising power that wants to displace my country in the global system. And you're staring in the East at a country that wants to revise the European order. And in the South, my French colleagues, you're looking at Africa that has arrived in Europe. Your border is not in the Med anymore, it's in the Sahel. It's in MENA, it's deep into Africa. And we're having a conversation about how to actually work out an institutional arrangement that would allow the Europeans to claim greater autonomy in some form or fashion, or do projects. Military power is not about efficiency of projects, it's about effectiveness of military force. So all this conversation is very tactical to me, and I apologize for the lengthy introduction, and I hope we'll address these issues on my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll just pick up the Swedish voice there. Jana.
Hi, Jana. The Swedish Atlantic Council, where I am Parliament, OSCE, and EU as well, former in my career. Just to have a northern perspective, I think it's not that difficult for us northerners to understand that you have frontline states in Europe, both to the east, from Finland all the way, and to the south. We better understand the importance of having a Europe security in different directions. And also beyond Europe. I mean, Crimea, Ukraine, the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine is perhaps one of the most important things for you. Or, what has not happened in Libya, for example, the lack of engagement for us in Libya, Mali, they have it, Syrians. We have a lot of Syrians living around in Stockholm, for example. The proportion of our population, in fact, is one of the biggest in Europe. So we very well understand this. So what we need, though, is really to have a strategic common view and start more on the European together with the Americans. Because the Americans are still, for a long time, and perhaps forever, I don't know, the main military actor in it. And that is where we have to start. Essentially, I think there is not a problem of the fundamental understanding of that we have to take a bigger part of the defense burden in Europe. In that sense, the Americans were right. Even before Trump, Congress, of course, has spoken about this for decades. Not least because America has other responsibilities outside of the European vicinity. And I think we have to find a way to have this dialogue, including the Americans, including the British, including EU. By the way, the pro-EU attitudes are at its highest in Sweden. It's never been as positive to EU as it is today, according to recent opinion polls. Partly because of Brexit, which is rather interesting reaction. But to find this common way of defining what we are going to do, which are not that difficult. Supporting Ukraine, being in Mali, doing a job in Libya, not just having the Americans do it. We have to take our responsibility. I mean, we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. It's not that difficult. And I think that is really where we have to start. Not to say the smaller part. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've had an American perspective, a Swedish. Now we'd just like to add a question as well, something that I think should be part of any discussion like this, and that is China, which we haven't really touched upon. We're not only interested in our region, and do you think that, or in Europe, representing your country's positions, what will be the role of the EU when it comes to a future kind of stand-up between the US and China? Is this an area for a NATO contribution? What role is there to play for the European Union and perhaps also European defense in the coming years? So I'll leave you with that, and I'll let the panel maybe reverse order. Please, Barbara.
Okay, well, I just picked some of these points. Firstly, to respond to Jana, when I say that US engagement in European security is an anomaly, that is not a normative statement at all. It is an analogous statement, precisely linked to the question Julian asked, like how can you explain that the US taxpayer should pay for such a rich region's defense? And I cannot explain it. This is why I say it's an anomaly, and I see it sort of as a leftover from the Cold War. So that's my first point. My second point is that I'm reasoning, I guess, in longer periods than might have become clear here. I think that really, if you look at 50 years from now, the transatlantic picture will look very much differently because of the rise of China that was just mentioned and other development elsewhere in the world, which means that, to be very blunt about it, the US will be busy elsewhere. Thirdly, and that will be my last remark, this is precisely why I think stepping up efforts on European defense is key in order to preserve that transatlantic link. It's not about kicking out the Americans, it's just that assuming that the Americans will be busy elsewhere and will probably even need our help elsewhere, in order to preserve that link we have with you, we need to step up our efforts and see that there are some things that we can do on our own, strategic autonomy, but that in general we just fit better into this whole burden sharing dimension. That's the message I want to convey, and that's a message that I really believe is the right analysis to have for future European defense debates.
I second Barbara on what she said last, that the EU, the Germans need to do more in any scenario. I mean, 2 years from now, who knows who comes after Trump, and that is, I think, not the question. The question is what Martin said during the debate: do we have to call the US after 72 hours when we kind of try to conduct a military operation somewhere in Africa, or shouldn't we? And I think we shouldn't. I think we should be more able to do more things in whoever is the next American president, and I think this is also strongly in the American interest, but not as a counterweight or as kind of when the US crosses red lines or something like this. And two other points, or it's more actually a wish list. I mean, we are approaching Christmas. I would wish for the Germans to be more open again towards the French and to move, I mean, without trying to, without all of a sudden like doing kinetic operations somewhere in Africa, but to show more support to the French, and that is something that is kind of forgotten in Germany, and maybe we were reminded of this when we saw the Yellow Vest uproar, that there is a time limit to this, and the extremes in French are very strong, and whoever succeeds President Macron is most likely not such a great friend of Germany as this president, and I think Germany so far, and that's not limited to defense and security, has not done enough to make this president a success. That does not mean to give in everything that he wants, but this means to be more constructive and to keep that in mind, and that doesn't justify that maybe President Macron has done terrible things with his, and the Yellow Vests have, I don't know, good points, but just strategically, whoever comes after Macron is most likely not to be such a good friend. And so I think the Germans need to be more accommodating. And the second wish would be that the Germans would become more flexible when it comes to European security and defense, and not think in boxes so much, like that's what we do in NATO, that's what the EU is for, but to think of it more flexible without kind of engaging in coalitions of the willing all the time and all over. And just, I mean, China is really, I think, too big of a topic to open it at the last 20 seconds of a panel, but that is a big challenge for Germany and the EU from a German perspective. I think the Germans are slowly waking up to the challenge. They have tried to ignore the challenge for a very long time. I saw China first and foremost as an economic opportunity, and now the German awareness of also China's engagement in the EU, in Hungary, financing of critical infrastructure and all this is growing. But so far we have been fence-sitters, and I think this is what Germany really feels, to be kind of, for the moment I think we still sit on the fence and look what the US and China are doing and look at these two superpowers, and I think there is a growing question for Germany, because I mean, two elephants, I mean, either they are in love, that is a problem for the grass on the ground, or they fight, and this is a problem for the grass on the ground. So I think if we have the grass on the ground, we have to kind of decide what we want to do, and we, so far, there is a huge opportunity for transatlantic relations vis-à-vis China, but Germany is slowly, as in all things, moving there.
2 points quickly. One is something I should have mentioned actually about the French perception. When we talk about 2%, when we talk about capabilities, and when we talk about in general taking more of the burden, obviously, and it's not here to say that, but geography matters. So as much as the French should understand that they are frontline countries, there is a sense of an existential threat when you are in Central, Eastern, or Nordic Europe. There is also a sense when you are in France, Portugal, Spain, that the threat is not as imminent. And geography matters on the other way as well, right? And so the French position on taking more of the burden has always been that threat perception is not enough. If you want the French, the Spaniards, Portuguese, and others to spend more, it can't be just to react to a threat. It has to be also for economic reasons. And it's extremely frustrating, obviously, and I would say it's also kind of in contradiction to what I was saying, that the French wants to talk about defense and not other matters. But the truth is that it is extremely important in terms of political narrative to base our increase in our defense budget on the economic benefit that it will have for our economy. And this is something I think is also important, a discussion to have with our US ally, to say that as much as it may be frustrating for you to hear, threat perception is different in Europe than it is in Washington or in Tallinn or in Stockholm. And therefore, the economic benefits of our industrial increase have to be taken into account. Second thing is, again, something that I understand is extremely annoying when you stand in Washington, is that we Europeans tend to go to Washington and always ask, can you tell the Germans that, can you tell the Poles that, can you make sure that they're agree? But this will continue. I mean, I understand that, and especially for the Trump administration, given his personal attitude vis-à-vis this kind of transatlantic issues, but this will continue. We will continue to go to DC and say, can you push Germany a bit more? Can you do that with the Poles? And so I'm a bit here, it's a bit of a dead end, but the truth is that Washington has to be prepared for this, I would say, kind of childish behavior from Europeans to continue. And this is also something we can say about our strategy vis-à-vis China. Often what we hear is, why doesn't the US tell us what to do? There's been this complaint at the time of the pivot, complaining that Europe was not enough involved in the US strategy at the time. And today, there is also this reaction to West Mitchell's speech at the Atlantic Council when he was talking about frontline countries and their engagement in the competition with China. Where is Western Europe in this speech, right? So there's still this attitude of waiting for the Americans to tell us what to do. My feeling is that the US should be ready for it to continue, as frustrating as it may be, but I don't see us going out of it.
Martin, Barbara, Jana, thank you very much for coming to Stockholm. I want to try to summarize this very rich discussion, but I think, to paraphrase Barbara, that we are all on a higher philosophical level after hearing you explain the end engine of German way how it works. And please, and your wish list, I don't know about that, if you would find some kind of treat under your name. You already did. Okay.
So we're
So thank you.